All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the heck in the world you are. It's me, the Guerrilla Economist. We have none other than the man, the myth, the legend himself, London Paul. It's a special Sirius report because we're about to get real serious. And folks, if you haven't got a chance to go check out the SiriusReport.com, I suggest that you get up and go do it. Get over there to the SiriusReport.com, join their membership list for less than a price of a latte over at Starbucks. You can get the play-by-play, the inside track of what's going on in the geopolitical, geostrategic, and geoeconomic way of things, the only way that he knows how. The man, the myth, the legend himself. He is the Gandalf of geopolitics. He is the wizard of world economics, the one and only London Paul. Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, it's 9 o'clock at night here, so we're quite late today. But yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing good, Paul. I'm doing good. I recommend also people subscribe to this channel, so when Paul's on, you will be alerted. Hit the subscribe button, like, comment, share. Paul, I'm doing great. Paul, you had us in anticipation since over a week now. I am chomping at the bit. I have a fresh brewed cup of coffee, nice dark roast going, and I'm ready to receive, my friend. I'm ready to receive from you because you have been to the mountaintops.
Ooh.
Could you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
We lose Paul?
Paul, you there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
There he is. He's
See
back.
that? Already the Anons are attacking you, Paul.
Yeah, he did. He went a bit wonky there, didn't it, for 20 seconds or something? But
a little bit. Absolutely.
Anyway,
Paul, what's going on? Fill us in. What's new? What's happening?
Right. Well, I kind of had a thought about over sort of the back end of last week about the kind of current developments in what's going on in Washington, and I kind of went back and thought, when Trump was elected, and the kind of things that I was concerned about, and what we've talked about quite extensively for nigh on 2 years now, and then piece it together with everything that's happened recently, and started to sort of formulate a picture. And no doubt there'll be people who'll disagree with me, but I'm just going to give some fact. These are just factual things that have happened, and why I have a degree of concern. And not for Trump himself. I mean, we always have this polarized viewpoint that Trump's cabal, and he's just, a deep state actor, or, Trump, everything Trump does is perfect. He never makes a single mistake, and it's neat, and he certainly isn't a deep state actor. But he's made quite a lot of mistakes. Now the question is, to what extent and why is he making these mistakes? But if we go back to when he was elected, and prior to him even being elected, I said he'll win the presidential election. This was a long time before, even earlier than 2016. I said he'll win, provided they don't knock it, they don't kill him. And of course, he wins the election. And then we said, well, okay, he's going to have serious problems because there's going to be deep state operatives on the Democrat side and the Republican side. Everyone was gunning for him. With literally everybody was gunning for him. And, we had the whole Mueller investigation. We don't need to go into that. But he was under severe pressure. But what was the one thing when we started out? He was very adamant that he wanted to try and build ties with Russia, and he wanted to build ties with China. And that is irrefutable. The history proves that. Now, okay, Russia's an entirely different kettle of fish, because the Mueller investigation was the way of preventing him actually ever formulating and building any relations with the Russians. But certainly he started out with good intentions with regards to China. And very rapidly, relations with China deteriorated to the point now that it's all out economic war. And maybe a bit later on, if we get time, we'll talk about the Pence interview at the Hudson Institute, of all places, and the kind of things he discussed. But let's just put it this way. Relations with the Chinese are about as bad as they've ever been. I mean, Trump will say, well, I'm still, when he said, well, I'm good friends with Xi Jinping, well, I hope I'm still good friends with him. He says the same thing with Putin, but to be honest, the Russians and the Chinese are sick to the back teeth of the Trump administration's policies, not necessarily Trump, of course, but as we said, Trump's the president, so he has to take responsibility for what his administration does. But all along, I've had concerns about Pence, and we'll come to Pence shortly, but he's been extremely quiet until very recently when he's suddenly starting to become vocal. And I thought, why now? Why after nearly 2 years is this guy suddenly becoming quite vocal? I then started to also have concerns. I mean, the Kavanaugh thing we'll discuss in a little bit of detail, but or maybe no, let's just jump into it now. Clearly, it was some diabolical political scam from the Democrats thinking, in some way we're going to be able to prevent Kavanaugh being elected to the Supreme Court. It's going to be a big political win for us, and we'll discredit the Republicans, and the American people will back us and vote for us. Well, of course, it's completely blown up in their face in totality. But the point about, and I covered this, and I podcast subscribers don't mind, but back on I checked the date, back on the 20th of September, I said, setting aside all the sort of circus with Ford and Kavanaugh, I've got concerns about Kavanaugh. And principally, there was two main reasons. Well, he became to light his attitude about the Fourth Amendment, which I'm sure all Americans know what it is, which basically, for anyone who doesn't, it relates to privacy. And an example was given where there was some person who was talking in New York to this book agent in Florence in Italy. The NSA were listening into the conversation, thinking the person was a terrorist just because they were speaking Italian, which beggars belief, but yeah, it's true. And as a result of all this, there was no need for any prosecution because there was no violation of the Fourth Amendment. And by all accounts, that was attributed to Kavanaugh. So I went, hang on, I have a bit of a problem with this person's attitude towards, for example, the Fourth Amendment. Then we get on to the Patriot Act. And this is where, for me, it becomes a bigger concern, because with regards to the Patriot Act, who was one of the people behind the writing of the Patriot Act? Yes, it was Brett Kavanaugh. Now, the question is, why is George W. Bush pushing this guy really hard, saying, I'm a big advocate of Brett Kavanaugh, we really need to get him in the Supreme Court? That's another reason for me to be pretty concerned about it. Now, in August, the Senate Judiciary Committee apparently released the first production of records for the Supreme Court, obviously nominee at the time, Brett Kavanaugh, for his time as Associate Counsel for George W. Bush. Now, over 5,500 pages of documents were made available to the public. Does anyone recall this even being discussed publicly? Was this much in the news? I didn't hear much about it, if anything. And apparently the documents showed that Kavanaugh assisted in the efforts to pass the Patriot Act and drafted a statement that Bush, the president at the time, incorporated into the bill signing. And Kavanaugh wrote that the Patriot Act will update laws authorizing government surveillance, which he claimed and Bush then restated were from an era of what were called rotary phones. But in fact, the Patriot Act weakened numerous US privacy laws that everybody knows. And of course, both laws were enacted. This is in relation to this privacy, what was it? There was something to do in the Cable Act and the email safeguards. There was one in the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And both laws were enacted after the era of rotary phones. So therefore, hang on, there's something strangely not quite right about that. And then in an email exchange, Kavanaugh also stated the Patriot Act was a measured, careful, responsible, and constitutional approach. Now, I have major problems with the Patriot Act, as I'm sure everybody does, because it comes back to this whole point. When 9/11 was probably in modern history the worst atrocity to happen on US soil. And who was in office at the time? The Bush administration, the neocons. Brett Kavanaugh is therefore working with George W. Bush. What side of the political fence does this guy really sit on? I don't know. I'm not sure. My concern as well is that you could arguably say, well, yes, the balance of power is now being shifted in the Supreme Court from, and I mean, personally, I don't think the Supreme Court should be politicized at all. I think everyone in there should be apolitical, and they should be making decisions not based on any political stance. But by all accounts, the balance is being shifted in the direction of the Republicans. And why is George W. Bush pushing the guy? Do the neocons think they've got a shoe in here for Brett Kavanaugh? I don't know, but I have my suspicions that's what they think. And then we come to another point that deeply concerns me, and we've discussed this before. There's a big push in certain quarters to give this impression that the deep state all revolves around the Democrats. That it's, it's the Clintons, it's the Obamas, it's all these, Democrat. No mention of the fact of the neocon influence. And we come back to 9/11 and the Patriot Act. I mean, bear in mind, here's a document that was 24 or 42 pages long. That was passed into law. So apparently it was all written and passed into law 45 days after 9/11. Absolutely impossible. There is no way that document must have been written some considerable time before 9/11 ever happened. So of course that I think is reason, and isn't it interesting that recently, I mean, and I'm not sure whether you've discussed this because obviously I've been sort of rather busy and haven't, to be honest, listened to us. I often listen to the shows, but the US Senate's unanimously passed Resolution 610, which is called for the declassification and release of tens of thousands of pages of document relating to what they say Saudi Arabia and the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And the resolution, it lists a whole bunch of points, but things like the release of information regarding September the 11th, the terrorist attacks upon the United States, and, tens of thousands of pages of documents. And, if you want to read the whole list, I'm sure you can find it somewhere. So I find the timing of that extremely interesting. Because, put it this way, who do we think is going to get blamed for 9/11? Well, it most certainly isn't going to be the neocons that are going to get blamed for 9/11 or the Bush administration or anyone associated with it. They're going to throw the Saudis under the bus and blame them for it in totality. And I think that's almost a certainty. And why? Because clearly the one thing the neocons don't want to be doing is anybody to apportion any blame to them for what has gone on. But whatever the involvement of the Bush administration, there is absolutely no way that they can claim that 9/11 happened and they didn't know anything about it. I mean, and to whatever degree they're involved in, I can't comment. I don't know specifically, but I've again have serious concerns about that. But coming back to the point, there is this creeping way of convincing American people to buy this idea that it's all down to the Democrats. They're responsible for everything. And yet, what do we see creeping into in ever increasing amounts is this neocon influence inside the Trump administration. Bolton's a great example of this. And there are I've got serious concerns about Pompeo's attitude. And look at US foreign policy. When Trump came in, he was trying to build bridges with the Russians and the Chinese. Well, someone put a kibosh on that and has done everything to destroy and wreck relations with the Chinese. And the latest issue, of course, was with regards to the fact that we saw this accusation about hacking by the Chinese of, putting chips on US server boards that ended up just about everywhere. And there was all these huge accusations going around blaming the Chinese. Chinese have been pretty quiet about it, which made people suspicious. And now suddenly, not only does Apple and Amazon and Supermicro come out and deny any. So look, there's been no investigation. We don't know anything about this. Suddenly we have US Homeland Security coming out saying, hang on, we don't know anything about this. And believe it or not, the UK intelligence services have now also come out and said, denied, I'm sorry, there's no evidence about all this Chinese agents did anything of the sort. We found none of this evidence of any of these servers being, hacked with putting these chips on them the size of whatever, a thumbnail or whatever. Or I think they said a pencil head or something like that.
Grain of rice.
A grain of rice.
Yeah.
So they're all denying this, and yet there's someone in it came via Bloomberg, and I think Pence made reference to this. in his speech at the Hudson Institute. So almost from the Trump administration's perspective, there's absolute validity to this. Then there was the accusation that the Chinese are trying to disrupt the 2018 midterms because they're so angry with Trump's attitude towards the tariffs that they're trying to in some way prevent him being elected, which of course is absolute nonsense. But this stoking of tensions with the Chinese, for me is classic neocon tactics. They don't want relationships with anybody. The neocon tactic is death, destruction, and war with everybody. And there's something that really concerns me is US foreign policy. Trump came out and said, I think we need to take the troops out of Syria. And he was sincere about it. And what do we have? False flag chemical weapons attack a matter of days later. And they've done everything now to poison Trump's viewpoint with regards to Syria. So he's now basically gone away from the idea we need to take the troops out of Syria and we need to actually put more forces in Syria. And he's buying the neocon bullshit basically as to what's going on in Syria. He fell for the chemical weapons attack twice. I mean, we haven't had the false flag chemical weapons attack a third time as yet, and it seems less likely that will happen. But again, serious concerns about US foreign policy. The US is causing mayhem in Ukraine to the point that the Ukrainians now seem to think it's fair game to go all out war against Donbass. That's a US-backed initiative. And the US foreign policy is as neocon as it could be. And this is another reason why I'm deeply concerned by elements within the Trump administration. And my biggest overall fear, though, more than anything, and I'm not saying it's a certainty, but I think I have reasonable doubts that, with regards to the sincerity of the deep state element, I have a horrible feeling the neocons think they can hijack the Trump administration, because the one thing is, before they realized they did everything, and I don't doubt the neocons were all for getting rid of Trump. I mean, you look at people like Lindsey Graham, he's done the biggest 180 on Trump. And that doesn't raise alarm bells, and people like that, suddenly they're all pro-Trump because he's doing everything the neocons want him to do. And my concern is that from the neocon perspective, they want to throw the Democrats or the Democrats deep state under the bus, come out smelling of roses, say, well, we've dealt with the deep state. And they feel they can crush the Democrats into oblivion. I mean, the Democrats are doing a great job crushing themselves into oblivion. But effectively, you would almost end up with a one-party state, not literally in the US, and the neocons think, do you know what? We don't need to remove Trump anymore. We can hijack his administration because he's so popular with people. People love Trump. They think, because Trump is sincere. I know people wouldn't think he is because there are people out there who disagree. But they've seen now you don't need to remove him. We just convince him of doing the things we want to do, and they've certainly convinced him over foreign policy decisions. So now basically he's now backed all of his potential allies away. He's angering Europe, he's angered the Russians and the Chinese, and the list goes on in the Middle East. I mean, you can certainly see the relationships fracturing with the Saudis is one clear example of that. And I think the neocons think, well, do you know what, we can use Trump as a vehicle to promote what we want to do because he's so popular. I mean, the chances are, barring some incredible unforeseen event, Trump's likely to win the midterms really rather easily. And I think, almost landslide proportion. That gives their more power. And that's my fear, is that the neocons have hijacked the Trump administration. And yeah, they'll happily play this game of, and they don't want the sort of Democratic deep state operatives taken out of commission. They want all these tribunals to happen because then they've got a clear path. They can then effectively be in power for 2, 3, 4 more terms of office quite easily. And if that is true, and that comes to pass, the US has got more problems than it can ever imagine because they think they're voting to get rid of the deep state. They think the deep state's finished, and half of it will be, but half of it will remain in office in Washington, running amok with a foreign policy that is, frankly, to say it's out of control is an understatement. I mean, the world at times is taking a deep breath, going, "What the hell are they going to do next?" Because their behaviour and attitude is absolutely reprehensible with regards to just about everything. And this Trump never set out to do this. But who persuaded Trump to suddenly make such a big deal with the Chinese and go for the jugular and start saying, we're going to have a trade war? And when the Chinese refused to back off, they then started going even more for the jugular with the trade war. And to the point now, and maybe, you know, we can come to some of the comments that Pence made, which I think is very telling. But again, I have major concerns that suddenly Pence comes out, does this speech at the Hudson Institute of all people. And I'd advise people, don't take my word. If you don't know who the Hudson Institute is, go and investigate them. Go and look at what they do. And then you'll understand why I have concern that Pence goes there and makes these statements. And frankly, the statements he made regarding China are largely outrageous. I mean, they're the most ridiculous comment. And it's just, I mean, we think about the sort of demonization of Russia. This is on an entirely different level. I mean, this is like treating Russia like they're an ally now. Suddenly, it's all become China. And what did we say quite a way back? I said, if the neocon influence gets too great in the Trump administration, you'll see them go for the jugular with China. That's exactly what's now happening. This is irrefutable. If people don't believe what I'm saying, go back and listen to the shows and go back in the past. Okay, if you're not a podcast subscriber, you're not going to be able to hear those things. But this is all public record stuff. I'm not making things up. This is why I have concerns, because I've gone back and pieced a whole bunch of things together. And I am very, very concerned that's precisely what's been doing. And because of Trump's popularity, they've got a great vehicle, because people do. People see great hope in Trump for the future. And when Trump was elected, we all did. But now it's not so much about me doubting Trump's sincerity, but I think Trump's policies with regards to, well, foreign policy is just so out of control, it beggars belief. But I'm also concerned that the US internal policy is very, very concerning. Another classic neocon tactic is suddenly massively increasing military spending. And that's another big problem I have. And then the classic, let's make all these tax cuts and put them in place, which actually only benefits the richest, and everyone else doesn't stand to gain that much. And in the process, causes more crippling, budget deficits for the US in the process. And then selling all these ideas. I mean, this is something Pence came out with. Basically, China was almost threatening US farmers into saying, how appalled they were by Trump's, tariff policy with regards to, for example, soybean. That's simply not true. The farmers are furious about it because their business and their livelihood's been severely damaged. And then for Pence to sort of make this argument, well, China deliberately targeted our soybean. It was deliberate political targeting. Well, what the hell does he think that the US was doing to China? I mean, it's the most myopic, ridiculous, kind of stupid remarks that a vice president can make. It doesn't just damage his reputation with the Chinese and damage relations. It damages the US relations with the rest of the world, who's looking at him going, look, for goodness sake, how do you really think the rest of the world's that stupid to believe the comments you're coming out with? And I mean, we can go into some of the things he said, but it's just farcical, kind of typical neocon language. The neocon's mentality is do as we say, not as we do. And they bully every single nation. And that's what, I don't believe Trump ever set out to go, right, if you don't do what we say, we're going to sanction you into oblivion. We're going to actually instigate regime change. I mean, Venezuela is a great example. I mean, it's clearly obvious they want regime change. They forget the deficiencies of Maduro. But then they have the audacity to accuse Venezuela's economy of failing when they've done everything to wreck and destroy it. And then Pence had the temerity to criticize the Chinese for backing Venezuela in terms of trying to stabilize their economy. Well, they're doing it Pence, because you or your administration is trying to wreck a nation. I mean, how many nations are the US trying to wreck on the planet at the moment? Syria is another great example. They're aiding and abetting ISIS like you've never seen in your life. And when they're confronted with all this evidence, they just sit there blindly and deny it. When the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians have more evidence than anyone can imagine. And this is the other thing. We noticed all this endless now propaganda. And people say, well, you're just defending China. No, I'm not just defending China, because the accusations they're making against China are falling apart. And the whole hack thing proves it. Because if your Homeland Security and the UK intelligence service are saying, excuse me, this is not true. Well, are they lying as well? No, they're not. The problem is the US are angry with China because China had the temerity to stand up and say to them, do you know what? We're not tolerating your aggressive bullying behavior. So we want to have normalized relations. I mean, for Pence to go, well, Trump wants normalized relations with the Chinese. Well, you've got a damn funny way of showing it. I mean, it's like, oh, please, China, do this and help. You know, let's sit down and have sensible discussion. But by the way, we're just going to do everything to antagonize you about Taiwan. And then Pence even makes reference to that, you know, and Pence's attitude is that, you know, we're having nobody challenging what the US wants to do on the world stage. Well, this is a ridiculous sentence, and this is not what Trump wanted. Trump didn't come into office to alienate himself from every other nation on the planet and back the US into a corner where they're isolated, and to the point where the rest of the world is sick to death and has had enough. I mean, I can't say this. The Chinese reaction in diplomatic circles to the American is about as savage as any diplomat's ever been in modern history. That's how fed up they are with the US attitude. And this is all classic neocon type mentality. And that's why I think the neocons are very, very happy to see the Democrats collapse in a heap. And I mean, of course, they will be. And if, you know, adjudication comes about and the, you know, heads roll from the Democrat side of the equation, they're going to be extremely happy. But here's the thing. Everyone's putting and backing that somehow Kavanagh's going to be the Supreme Court nominee, or now Supreme Court judge, who's going to tip the balance. And suddenly we're going to see all these mass arrests. Well, how's that going to square up with Kavanagh's clear relations with George W. Bush? What's he going to do? Go, well, actually, we're just going to ignore the mass arrests with regards to the Bush administration and the Bush side of the equation and all the neocons and all the things that the despicable things that they've been involved in, not just the Democrat. How's this guy going to manage this process? I don't see that's ever going to happen, because he's going, you know, it does raise the question. How is he going to react? How is he going to deal with things? And what's going to happen if the 9/11, all the documentation and all the truth comes out? And here's the other thing. Why did Trump say, yeah, I'm going to have every single document related to 9/11, I'm going to release the lot? Then he suddenly went, oh, no, we can't do that. Because he was getting pressured not to do it. Who's going to pressure him not to do it? The neocons. They don't want this information coming out. And that's why I think we're all getting set up to blame the Saudis and then try and, in a way, deflect all the criticism away from the Bush administration and whatever involvement they had or didn't have. But let's face it, I mean, in the immediate aftermath, and all the stories that came out regarding were just simply implausible. So for them to deny any involvement is simply incredible. It's just incredible that they could even consider doing that. But I don't see Kavanaugh as being the guy who's going to suddenly set this whole wheels in motion and change everything. It's not going to happen. And again, I think the problem is everyone's been set up to believe that somehow, you know, Trump's got everything in hand. Yeah, he's got these great strong relations with the Chinese and the Russians. Don't worry, he's just playing a game. The rest of the world's not playing the game anymore. The rest of the world's had enough. Why do you think Russia dumped all their treasuries? Why do you think China's dumped massive amounts of treasuries, which the US is trying to hide? Why do you think I mean, if this was 1939, China would now be at war with Russia, in the literal sense of the word. It's only that we're now in the year 2018. That's why it's not happened. That's how bad relations are. There's no game being played. And this is the
You
problem.
mean
I think.
China would be in war with the U.S., not Russia?
Sorry.
You said China would be in war with Russia?
Oh, sorry. No,
Yeah, that's
China.
like,
What the hell? Yeah, no. China. Yeah. Blimey, that would be a bit weird, wouldn't it?
that would be very
No, but
strange. I'd have to
that would
reevaluate many things, Paul.
that would be like the
My
ninth
worldview is
dimensional
totally
chess.
skewed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be nine-dimensional chess. No, of course, the US and China will almost certainly be at war now with each other if it was, decades ago. That's how bad relations are. And the rhetoric that Pence came out with just eloquently proves that. So this is why I see everything at the moment where it's neocon influence inside the Trump administration. Now, you could arguably sit there and go, well, there's a gigantic game going on. Don't worry, they're going to deal with the Democrats. Then they're going to turn around and deal with the neocons, and they'll finish the whole cabal in the US off. Well, given the influence the neocons clearly have in the Trump administration, does anyone seriously imagine that's going to happen? It won't. Till that influence is gone, then there's no chance of that happening. And the risk is that the US gets, and here's the other thing, the great thing the neocons really want to do is anybody who criticizes them is going to be branded as unpatriotic, who doesn't love and care and for America, because that's another classic tactic the neocons try to employ. So anyone who criticizes what's going on, if you criticize US foreign policy now, you're not patriotic, you're not standing up for the ways of America and how we need to conduct ourselves on the world stage to protect our national interest. That's the kind of bullshit that they're now trying to convince American people. So this is why I have major problems when the whole thing regarding Iran was completely skewed with the JCPOA and turned into this idea that JCPOA was some big cabal agreement. Absolutely not. So you're telling me the Russians and the Chinese were part of this? Absolutely not. And now we have this idea of Pence coming out with the speech and at the Hudson Institute, and somehow everyone needs to pay attention to that because that's exactly spot on with what's going on in the world. Well, I'm sorry, it's absolute nonsense. People can accuse me of being very pro-China. They can say whatever they like, but go and listen to the speech. And if you really think that is absolutely eloquently suggests what China's doing on the world stage, then please explain how, because none of it makes any sense whatsoever. And,
it's
that's
a
clearly
fantasy by a guy who's experienced in foreign policy, who's experienced in understanding how the world really works. Paul, is next to nil. He has no credibility. He has no experience. He has done nothing in international business or finance that lends him to any sort of credence in saying that, hey, this is the way China works. They're dominating the world. They're forced. Paul, just today we had news come out that the U.S. is forcing, via force and threat of force, other allied countries to buy our stupid, worthless LNG. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and this, yeah, exactly. And people, seriously, here's the question. If your nation, that is their foreign policy, do you really seriously imagine that administration is going to treat its own people in a totally different way? If your own people in your nation start to defy you, do you think they're just going to go, okay, sorry, we'll change our course and do something differently? Absolutely not. I mean, and that's the biggest problem. I really do fear that the American people are being duped into buying this idea. And it's not Trump. Trump is not the problem here. It's the people controlling and trying to control Trump who are going to subjugate his administration. So everything Trump stands up for and wants to believe in is not going to happen. And in the process, they're going to take control and think, well, the Democrats, I mean, I am a little bit suspicious that the Democrats seem to have a suicide pact with themselves to destroy themselves.
They really do. They really
yeah. Mm-hmm. And I have to ask the question, why would you do this? I mean, look, if they wanted to really have a principled way of discussing the whole Havana thing, they could have done things very differently. But they actually destroyed themselves you would almost have to say it was intentional, because you couldn't be that ridiculous and stupid to try and think you could in some way prevent him being nominated. So I'm deeply suspicious why the Democrats seem to be on this suicide mission. And But it plays beautifully into the hands of the neocons in the process, and if you don't think the neocons have any influence over the Trump administration, go back to what Trump said when he was first elected and look at where we are now in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy. And the difference is it's staggering how different the Trump administration's become. And you know what? I think the problem is they've convinced Trump to do numerous things. They convinced Trump regarding the JCPOA. Well, I heard a story. Do you know who actually convinced Trump to walk away from the JCPOA? Netanyahu. That's what I was told. That's what I was told. Now, that raises a whole bunch of very serious questions with regards to the Israeli lobby and the influence they have over the Trump administration in the process. But, I'm sorry, you believe Netanyahu? What's his track record for believing anything? So therein is another big problem. And the list goes on. And we said at times where we were concerned about the Trump, and then we thought he seemed to lose elements of control. Then he regained it. And now, have you noticed all of a sudden, no one's even really talking about the Mueller investigation anymore? It's almost like, well, we just don't really want to talk about that anymore. But even in the Republicans, they were foaming at the mouth about things within the first year of the Trump presidency. Now they've all shut up about it. And it's almost like no one wants to talk about it anymore. And it'll probably just die a death, and people try to deny it ever happened. Well, the question is, why suddenly Trump got all this massive support amongst the Republicans in his own, when he really never had it? They were all very vocal and critical of him in the past. It's because he's doing everything the establishment in the Republicans want him to do. And in a way, as I say, you can hijack his personality, because let's face it, when did the Republican Party last have a president who's got that charisma that the American people attach themselves to and really want to follow and believe in? When did they last have that? Maybe Reagan? I don't know. I'm not sure, but the point is that is the allure of Trump. And Trump, in that sense, they could subjugate Trump and use him for their own ends and convince him of the foreign policy decision. And arguably trade wasn't right with China. And maybe historically the US shouldn't have done what they did, but the US exported its trade to China because they could make bigger profits by doing it than producing the goods in the US themselves. And let's be honest, what are we now seeing with tariffs? The only people who are going to get hurt is the American people, because they're going to have to pay significantly more for whatever goods and services they get from China because of the tariffs. That's down to their own administration that's caused this. And it's completely, nobody wins in a trade war, but the US is going to hurt infinitely more than the Chinese. They're going to hurt, but the US will hurt infinitely more. And it's a stupid, farcical policy that is not going to do the US any good in terms of its economics, and its economic situation is pretty dire anyway, despite the idea of trying to convince everyone to the contrary. So it's destructive, and that's the whole neocon mentality is just destructive. They never want to do anything constructive. If you look back in history through the Bush administrations, they weren't very keen on actually formulating solid relations with anyone. Anyone who got in the way, they steamrolled them, and anybody who was supposedly an ally had to bow to them and do exactly what they wanted or face the consequences. So it doesn't bode well, and I'm not trying to scare people, but these are facts, and it doesn't mean that it's the end of the Trump dream. Far from it. But unless there's someone turns course pretty soon, and we come back to the fact that once the midterms are out the way, that is the defining point. Because by all means, I suspect or believe that Trump should win pretty easily. But then we have to start to see some real moves inside his own administration to deal with the internal problems his administration has, as well as the wider problems to do with all the alphabet agencies, etc. And if we don't see it, then I'm sorry, but you then start to have to question this idea that any of these things are actually anything other than a pipe dream. There's not reality to it. And I'm sorry that it's going to upset people saying this, but everything I've said is factually correct.
Paul, you may be right, Paul, but you're really not following up what's going on in 24chan. You know what 24chan is? That's the newest site That is the successor to 4chan and 8chan. It's 24chan. And did you know that this is Red October? Did you know that this is the month of called Red October, Paul? Did you know that? Did you?
Well, yeah, but do you know what? We had March, we had April, we had May, June.
It doesn't matter.
July,
but
August, September.
Paul, there was no color in connection with the month. That's why this month is different. This is Red October. You didn't hear about Blue March or Purple or Purple February. You didn't hear about that. You didn't hear about Pink November.
Yeah, but you know what? But I mean, I don't mention this very often, but there was a Q post that really concerned me when people were told to go and listen to the Pence interview with regards to China, because facts matter. That's what people were told. Facts matter. Go and listen to the Pence. And people wonder why I have concerns about it. Because I'm sorry, there was a whole bunch of absolute bullshit said by Pence in that interview. Facts, I mean, I'm sorry, absolute nonsense. And it annoys me that with the idea that we're supposed to be dealing with reality and the criticisms levied at China. Yeah, you may argue with regards to some of China's policy, but basically all China's doing is saying, we're going to go and start trading with the world. So what does the Pence accuse them of? Bullying nations into trading with them, giving them these sort of dubious loans and then calling in the loans and seizing assets. He mentioned Sri Lanka and the port there. But it's quite interesting that the Sri Lankans have just come out and said, I'm sorry, this is absolute nonsense. China hasn't done anything of the sort. Trying to convince the world that all these nations are walking away from the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, no, they've taken a step back and gone, hang on, this previous administration, we're not happy with what they're doing. Pakistan being a great example. They're now all pushing ahead and wanting to sign agreement far in excess of what the previous administration wants to do. Pence has the temerity to say, well, the Chinese, spending 70 billion a year on military, it's more than the rest of the Asia Pacific region. Maybe he doesn't fail to mention about the fact that the US is spending 10 times that. But that's okay because, the US can do that. He talks about wanting to push the US away from the Western Pacific and that China's militarized the South China Sea. Well, yeah, they did. But the question he doesn't answer is what the hell is the US doing thousands of miles from the US there in the first place? And then says, the US Navy will go wherever our national interests permit. Well, the national interest according to you, but not the rest of the world. And then says, China's chosen economic aggression. No, they chose a multipolar world and everyone wants to trade with them. And nations aren't being bullied. A lot of nations have had their debt cancelled because they couldn't repay it. Talks about this China's surveillance state with the help of US technology, how they're restricting the flow of information. He mentioned all about this lack of religious freedom. He mentioned reference to burning Bibles and tearing down crosses, and there's desperate times for Chinese Christians. But it's quite interesting how much the Christianity's grown in China in the last decade. I mean, it's something like 100 million Christians. So I don't know how China's got time to persecute all these people on an individual basis. Mentions about Xinjiang and talks about the 1 million Muslims in government camps. Well, that's been disproved and proved to be nonsense. And goes on, about Beijing wants to extend its reach across the wider world. Well, what the hell does he think the US has been doing for decades? And the list goes on and on. It's absolute crass hypocrisy. And the world's had enough of it. But the scary part for me is when people are told to go and view it because facts matter, as though this is all factual. This is just propaganda. And when something that purports to be in the best interest of America and tells everyone to go and to listen to this, I have to question it. I have to seriously say, why would I want to listen to anything an entity says that tries to make people suddenly see that China's the biggest bogeyman on the planet? The plain simple fact is the US is furious because China is now economically trading with most of the world. It admits, Pence admits, well, they're trying to steal our allies off us and make friends with our enemies. No, China isn't doing anything of the sort. China is just making friends of the world, saying there's a different way to doing things. We don't need gunboat diplomacy anymore. Let's actually have normalized relations with other countries. And then it's just that you go, if you haven't heard the speech, go and listen to it and come back and say to me that you think it's a balanced viewpoint of China, and that it's factual and correct. And if you do, please substantiate those comments. And if you don't, then question those that are telling you to go and listen to it and regard it as being in good faith, because that for me is a huge problem.
But Paul, you don't understand. Where we go one, we go all, Paul. I don't think you get that.
Well, look, I don't doubt that. I mean, it's very good to sell the patriot angle to the American people. The neocons are classics for doing that. They defended the war on terror as a way of to defend the interests of the American people, to protect America, to protect our integrity. The war on terror was just designed to go and blow half the world up and seize control of 7 countries. And if you don't believe me, ask Wesley Clark. He told people. He said that's exactly what the US administration was doing. We know the war on terror was a complete lie, but they sell faux patriotism. This isn't patriotism. The neocons don't give a damn about any American people. I don't doubt Trump does. Trump is, if you want to talk about patriotism or nationalism, Trump cares deeply. And I know there's people out there who disagree with me, but he does. He cares about America and the American people, and he wants the best for them. I don't doubt that. But I think he does have sincerity, but those surrounding him in his administration lack even a scintilla of sincerity. And what bothers me is that when you listen to the Pence speech, it's all about we're going to promote our interests, and then accusing China wants a different US president. It's meddling in the US democracy. It's been targeting our federal and local governments regarding tariffs. It's trying to split, domestic groups and divisions and create divisions in the US. You think Russia's bad. Well, you want to see what the Chinese are doing. And the list goes on and on. He says the American farmers are standing with Trump. They're not. He talks about this new trade deal with the Canadians and the Mexicans, and says it's a great deal for American farmers and manufacturers. Well, it's a white elephant. Then he actually has the temerity to say that, in terms of US investment, the Chinese Communist Party could veto that in China. And then in the next breath, we hear the terms of this new agreement with with the Canadians and the Mexicans. The US has a veto over Canada signing a free trade agreement with China. I mean, does Pence not go, hello, I'm accusing the Chinese of exactly what we're doing to prevent the Chinese trading with Canada? It's absolutely farcical. And then the list goes on and on and on. And I'm sorry, but I'm sick to death of hearing this absolute unmitigated bullshit that the likes of Pence come out with, which is a disgrace to the American people and to the good name of America across the world. And what bothers me is people believe that this administration, the way it's behaving like that, not how Trump wants, is the future. You really think that's going to save America as a nation? Well, who's America going to trade with? Even if this all turns out, when all they've done is anger beyond
Paul,
anything that's going
we're going to trade with Canada.
Well, just but
take care of us.
And how long's that going to last before the Canadians do something that angers angers the US in the process? I mean, and the other thing is, it's like Pence. We're going to assert American interests across the Indo-Pacific. Well, the Indo-Pacific doesn't want the US asserting its interests over there. And he talks about the US wants a free and open trade with the Indo-Pacific. They don't. They're only doing this because they're terrified, and they've suddenly woken up to the fact that China actually needs to be taken seriously in terms of their economic prowess and capability. But it comes back to the point, he still hasn't worked out, or seemingly no one in the Trump administration except Trump has worked out, that the dollar's dead or dying, that China's their biggest creditor. And the other thing is, China has a lot of raw materials that the US is absolutely desperate for, and they can't. Now, China suddenly says, we're not supplying you those raw materials anymore. The US has got a major problem. But this is why I'm concerned. I expected by now with the Trump administration to see not a complete normalization with relations with Russia. That was always going to be very difficult. But to see a normalization with the Chinese, to start to talk about investment, to actually not look to increase military budget to the point of stupidity and actually say, do you know what? We need a few $1 trillion to rebuild the infrastructure in America. Where's that promise gone? We never hear that anymore. All it is great big tax cut for the wealthiest and the richest in the US that benefit nobody but the wealthiest and the richest. That is not good policy. There's nothing internally, domestically, that's going to benefit the average American in any way, shape, or form. And that's just classic kind of Republican neocon economics. It's doomed to fail. I mean, we talk about, with all due respect, there's all this idea that the Democrats are trying to make out, well, the US economy is so strong because of Obama. Trump just came in on the blind side. Well, of course, that's nonsense. But equally, Obama wasn't, when did Obama become president? And when did the US economy collapse? It was during a Republican administration. So there's a precedent and a history for this where these problems occur. So we can't, and I'm equally concerned that, US economic policy is going to cause major internal problems. Never mind what it just does with the Chinese. And then here's the problem. Whatever our perspective on politics is, for me, the US is far too deeply divided along by these partisan, illusionary political parties between the Democrats and the Republicans. That is very, very divisive and dangerous for any nation to be that divided. The US needs to be united, and because it's the old cliche, divided, united, sorry, we stand, divided, we fall. And that's another big problem that the US faces because it is not addressing these issues. It's, I don't care for politics and the behavior of people and this Antifa and all these idiotic organizations whose behavior is reprehensible is one matter. But this is impacting American people. It's shaping people's view. This is dangerous. This is not anything that is a good thing that we have such division in terms of people along faux political lines that we all know doesn't matter who you vote for previously, you get the same government. So that equally will suit the neocons in every way, shape, or form. And let's be honest, I'm concerned sometimes by the rhetoric that Trump comes out with in that regard. Yes, we know there's idioticness goes on what you might term the left side of US politics. But there needs to be a way of saying we need to build bridges. We don't want to antagonize people even more because there's going to be huge economic upheaval in the world. And when that day comes, the US faces some big challenges because Trump's told the American people the economy is really strong. We've got the lowest unemployment since 1969, et cetera, et cetera. And when the economic reality hits home, what's he going to say to the American people? The American people might turn around and say to him, hang on a minute, you told us this, and now suddenly this has happened. And that could cause a huge, rift inside the US as well. The US needs to be strong and stand together for the big challenges it faces in a post-dollar world. And we're not seeing that. That's another problem that concerns me greatly. So I'm not saying this is a fait accompli, but we've said it before that the influence of the neocons in the Trump administration has been questionable, but it seems to be worse now than it's been in the, effectively, well, not the last 2 years, but since Trump's inauguration. And I'm not seeing any evidence of that lessening. And it all boils down to US foreign policy, which I'm sorry is totally out of control. And if anyone wants to convince me to the contrary, tell me why it's not. And just look at hand on heart what's going on across the world and deny that US foreign policy is out of control. Because it most certainly is, because at the moment they're trying to foment war in any place they can. And in the process, if nations that are weak, they're trying to implement regime change. Why do you think the neocons want Kim Jong-un to denuclearize unilaterally without any preconditions? And he knows this, and he's never going to agree to it because he knows that's what gives him the strength of position to be able to stand up to the US administration and say no. And he knows he's got the backing of the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Russians. And it's the same with Iran. It's the fear that made the US back off. I mean, I've said this to podcast subscribers. And we noticed recently how on several occasions the Iranians have launched missiles. They launched missiles in around east of the Euphrates that flew over the head of the American and hit Daesh targets inside Syria. Did you notice how the US didn't say anything back to the Iranian? Remember all the hot air about we're going to restrict the Iranians' missile capability? This is a declaration of war if you start launching missiles. Well, the Iranians launched missiles and Washington said nothing. And that shows because they fear the Iranians because they think the Iranians have a nuclear presence, which they don't. And neither do the North Koreans, but the mere fear they think they have it means that they'll have some degree of respect for these nations. But that's also why they know we can't defeat Iran via war, so we want regime change. And that's the other thing. That was another big Q push way back. Talked about regime change in Iran. That is classic neocon talk, because that's exactly what they've been trying to do for decades. So again, that's why I have problems with it. I don't have problems with people being woken up to the reality of what's going on. I don't have to agree. There's plenty of people out there I don't agree with in everything they say, but if the essence of what they're doing is good, then fine. But when I see comments made that make reference to Iran and regime change, and I see reference to listening to Pence and his comments about China, I have every reason to be concerned, because that is not representative of what the Trump administration stood for when he was elected. And it's most certainly classic neocon comments that they want to pick on a bogeyman, alienate them in the world's eye, and do everything to convince the American people that everything they're then doing, in this case the Chinese, is 100% justified, even if it means economically damaging parts of its own economy, which, let's face it, soybeans is a great big manufacturing base. The American farmers have spent decades building relationships, have a great relationship with the Chinese. That all got wrecked because China rightly said, well, we're not going to trade with you. I'm terribly sorry. We'll go and trade with the Brazilians. Instead, the Brazilians are very happy. And that's why they're now planting enormous additional crop yields for soybeans, because China's diversified its trade, and that's exactly what they'll do. But to then say the American farmers are standing by Trump, I'm sorry, it's just not true.
Paul, how do you think this thing's going to play out? We got the midterm elections right around the corner. After this whole Kavanaugh thing, I think the Democrats have really imploded themselves.
Oh yeah. I mean, yes, it's
ruined themselves. They're out of the running.
I think so. I don't give them a hope in hell of being elected. I think it should be pretty straight. I mean, you can never say never, but I can't think of any reason why Trump won't walk the midterms. Which, if I'm honest, from a Trump perspective, I'd far rather he walked it than the Democrats. But my concern is not Trump, and it never has been Trump. It's the people in his administration, those pulling the levers, convincing him about foreign policy, convincing him about domestic policy. But here's the acid test. If post the midterms and he wins by a landslide, where he then has the mandate, then that's the time when we should see some big significant changes, which is going to take the deep state down on both sides of the equation, not just the Democrats. I don't want to hear so-and-so's been arrested from the Democrat. I want to hear big Republican names who need to be arrested as well. The neocon elements to it, they're going to get arrested. You need to hear it across the board, not selective. Then I'll go, okay, great. The Trump administration isn't as weak as I thought it was in terms of the neocon. And I'll be I'll be the happiest non-American to see that happen, because that's hugely beneficial for the US and in the process massively beneficial for the rest of the world. Because put it this way, if the neocons have got control and they try to subvert the political system for their own ill-gotten gain and end up throwing half the deep state under the bus, that's very bad news for the Americans. But I'll tell you what's even worse news for the rest of the world, because what are they going to do? They're not going to stop there. They'll just go on full throttle uber neocon foreign policy, and that doesn't bode well for any nation on this planet. So it's extremely important what happens in the aftermath of the midterms. And if it does play out in a way that we hope to see, great. It means my fears are unfounded. But at the moment, I can only say what I see. And what I see does not look promising. But that doesn't mean in 2 or 3 months that the pendulum might swing and things might be very different. But I wouldn't place all your bets on Kavanaugh being the solution to the problem. I just don't see that happening. But it doesn't mean that Kavanaugh ever was the solution to the problem. That's the other point. But the question is, there's the likes of Sessions. What's going to happen if Sessions doesn't stand up? Sessions is going to probably end up fired. Well, how does that square up with the idea that somehow Sessions is a key player in the Trump administration? Because I don't see a shred of evidence to that. And saying he is means nothing unless it's backed up with hard, stone cold facts and actions. Then you start to believe it. I mean, but I'm not seeing it. I'm far too concerned about all this games that are apparently being played, and so is playing this person, and so is playing that. Well, at the moment, none of that is evident. That is all hope, belief in something. And do you know what bothers me more than anything? I think people get upset when I challenge these things, because if they feel, if I'm correct, then the US has no hope. And that's what they're frightened of. That's what upsets them more than anything. But I'm going to question it because that's my job to do that. My job isn't to sit there and swallow everything. I have to challenge things and say when I think there's a problem. But I've always said I will support the Trump administration when it does the right things. And particularly early on in his administration, I think he did a lot of really good things. But in the last 6 months or so, I can't think of many things the Trump administration's done that on a world stage or domestically that have been really beneficial to the American people. So then we have to be critical of it. But I don't think Trump's the problem. As I said, I mean, who suggested bringing Bolton on board? What did we say when Bolton was brought on board? It was a very bad decision.
Yep.
And I said
there goes the neighborhood. That's what you and I said, Paul. There goes the neighborhood.
And my other comment was, and I said at the time, if the US loses Tillerson, it will regret it severely. There will be a serious change in foreign policy. That's exactly what's happened.
Yep.
So, and I'm not saying Tillerson was perfect for the job or anything else, but I think Tillerson gave a sort of balance to the Trump. Trump hasn't got contrarian people in his administration saying, whoa, hang on a minute.
None. They all left.
Yeah, you need to think about what's going on here. Look at China. The way forward is to formulate strong relationships with the Chinese. You've got trade problems. No one's disputing it. But go and sit down and work things out. Discuss things. Don't have this idea we have to equalize trade between nations. You're never going to necessarily be able to do that. But say to the Chinese, okay, we need to build trust. And on the basis of trust, maybe we can have some inward investment in the US, which the US desperately need. The US now could have been economically in a far better position than it is in reality. And that's why, as you said, they got rid of all the ones who were there to sort of try and smooth things and really project the vision Trump had when he was elected. Everyone said when Trump said, I want to make America great again, the idea was that was to make America great again at all costs. That was never Trump's idea. The sad fact is that's almost what it's become like now. And I've had people disagreeing with me who have basically said, we're not tolerant, when Trump means making America great, that's, we're making it great at all costs. No, that was never Trump's intention. But sadly, his administration has been hijacked. That's the impression the world's getting. Now, that might not be what Trump thinks, but if that's the impression the world gets, the world will act accordingly. And the world's not going to play these games. They're not going to be going, well, let's second guess. Maybe Donald Trump doesn't mean this. Well, maybe his administration means that. When the Chinese get accused of hacking things, and they did, when they're accused of trying to hijack the midterm elections and try and ensure that Trump isn't president in 2020, when they're accused of all these things, they're not going to stand there and go, oh, don't worry, we know it's part of the game. No, it's serious, because the Chinese diplomat are furious. I mean, furious is an understatement. They're absolutely livid. And look at the comments when Trump accused them of meddling in the elections at the United Nations General Assembly. Look at the Chinese delegation and look at the look on their face. That isn't the look of, oh, don't worry, it's just part of the game with Trump. Don't worry, it's not a problem. They just first of all, it was like, I can't seriously believe he's actually saying it. And when they realised he's seriously believing it, it's the look of words fail me. And this is the problem. I don't see the same Trump viewpoint with when he first met Xi Jinping and what he's really trying to woo him, really trying to get him on side and change things. And then, but ever since that point in April 2017, it's been downhill ever since. And the relationships deteriorated rapidly. And put it this way, if your relationship deteriorates with China, it's not going to improve with the Russians. And what's the thing? The US is sanctioning everything. Anything that's Russian, made in Russia, vaguely looks like Russian, or maybe was related to a Russian 10 generations ago. They're trying to sanction it. And you really think that Putin's going to sit there and go, well, don't worry, it's okay. It's just part of the game. There is no game. There is no sort of crazy 4D chess game going on with the Chinese and the Russians or anyone else in the world. The world's had enough. And the reason they've had enough is because they actually thought when Trump was elected, we have a chance to normalize relations, to bring the US in, and the US can be this vibrant nation that's going to be great for the world. Why? Give me one reason why they would believe that now. There is no reason, because all they see is, if you don't agree with us, we're going to sanction you. But the world's turned around and said, like over Iran, and Europe's gone, we're not tolerating it. We're forming this special purpose vehicle, financial vehicle, which is going to bypass the dollar, and we're not tolerating it. People go, oh, it's just because it's the cabal. No, it's not the cabal, because the Russians and the Chinese part of it. But, there's a recognition in Europe for all its failures. And my goodness, there's a huge amount of failure. That even they go, we're going to have to normalize relations with the Chinese and normalize relations even with the Russians, and start to because Europe's changing. Europe's changing within pretty quickly now. And that's why we're starting to see this kind of change of attitude. But even they've recognized, this madness can't go on. But the US is just digging itself deeper into a hole that it's going to be very hard for it to get out of. And as I say, without laboring the point, I don't see that was Trump's vision for America when he was elected. But, it's amazing how over a period of time, someone's perspective can be skewed so much. But go back and listen to what Trump said before he was elected, and then in the immediate aftermath of his election and during his inauguration at the start, and tell me that that's the same Trump that people voted for in 2016, because it isn't. But I don't think fundamentally Trump's changed. And people say, well, he was always, co-opted. He was always part of that. He wasn't, because why were they doing everything to get rid of him? Well, do we see that same vitriol and hostility towards getting rid of him now? No, because he's towing the line of how the neocons in the Republican administration want him to behave. That's why they shoehorned people like Bolton in, because they knew he could have a massive influence on US foreign policy. Why did they do that? Because they were frightened. Hang on a minute. We have a risk here that Donald's going to normalize relations with the Chinese and the Russians. And what the hell's that going to do to our military industrial complex? That's the other thing. They want enormous military spending. Why? Because they make enormous profit from war, as they have done for decades. They love war for that reason. They don't care who dies and is killed in the process. I mean, the US forces that go out into all these countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that, they just see them as collateral damage. There was some famous quote, and I can't remember who basically mentioned about the fact that, we know that the US military are just cannon fodder for what we want to do. It's incredible they haven't realized we're actually doing that. That's how despicable these people are. They don't give a damn, but they'll sell it that it's all about patriotism. It's all about defending America's rights across the world. They're not interested in America's rights across the world. They're just interested in huge profit, death and destruction. That's the only language they understand. And that's why I'm very concerned about the future. And I hope I prove to be wrong. And I'll be very extremely happy but I think we'll have to see some pretty seismic changes, and maybe post, the midterms, we'll see that. But I'm not confident of that. And I'm always dealing reality. I'm never optimistic. I'm never pessimistic. I always try to look at things from a realistic perspective, and I'm not seeing the changes that, I mean, when Trump was first elected, I saw a lot of very encouraging things, but I'm not seeing that now. And that is why I'm very concerned and why I've said what I've said today. And I'm sorry if people don't like it, but what I'm saying is factually correct. And if facts matter, then what we've discussed today should matter. And that's why I've said what I've said.
Very well said. London Paul, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. And folks, again, go to the SiriusReport.com, check it out, join the membership list for some hard-hitting, truthful information. And you might not like everything Paul has to say. You might not agree with everything that Paul has to say, but his analysis, folks, his analysis is something that you should take very, very seriously and hold it against anything else that you would be hearing as a type of a standard. Listen to it, let it absorb itself, and keep learning. That's the whole thing. We live in a time where you cannot afford to be ignorant. You live in a time where you cannot afford just to have one point of view. You need to be challenged. If you have a specific viewpoint, I always tell people, gravitate towards sources and then challenge it. Take your viewpoint and put it to the test. Put it to the test. We here at Rogue News find the Sirius Report to be absolutely invaluable in regards to that. So please get over to the SiriusReport.com, subscribe for less than a price of a latte. You can get the play-by-play every day from Paul. And also, folks, subscribe to this site and click that notification bell so when Paul's back on, you are alerted. And with that being said, thank you all for joining us. CJ, take it away.